Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing this paper, mentioning this survey, which was released 2 months ago and is still somewhat current. What I did with this survey is I tried to identify which countries had dedicated or at least explicit protection of whistleblowers in their national legislation. And in fact, the hard part was to try to find in the corpus of national legislation which laws protected whistleblowers. And so the first finding in this review of, so I started with reviewing more than 100 countries' legislation, and I narrowed it down to 67 countries, which I review in the paper. But the first finding is actually not in the first observation is actually not in the paper, is that not all countries have proper or dedicated or formal, at least, whistleblower protections. And at least they don't have whistleblower protection laws. That's true for basically half of Latin America, a big part of Africa, a big part of the Middle East. But then the second observation is that the whistleblowing laws are a fairly recent phenomenon. I mean, out of the 67 national laws that are in the paper, only 4 were enacted before 2000,
Okay.
and more than 75% were enacted in 2010 or later. So it's a fairly recent development. And what I find interesting is that whistleblowing is not. It's not recent. It's not something that has been discovered recently.
So it's interesting to hear you identify that there's more of a recency towards actually legislating for the protection of whistleblowers. Why do you think that it's something that has much more recently become important to have legislation around?
Well, I would say that the realization that whistleblowers are key actors in helping solve societal problems is not recent. It's not new. This is the risk taken by whistleblowers have been known. It's always been risky to be a whistleblower. I think there is a recent sort of belief that whistleblowers can be helpful, can be really a tool. But and we've seen this in the EU with the directive which helped with this trend. But still, even in countries where you have, countries that appear to be very committed to the rule of law, there still is some level of skepticism, I find, and even defiance towards whistleblower protection and its real use.
And what do you mean by defiance in that context?
Well, okay, what I sort of realized during writing this paper is that the literature, the resources on what an effective whistleblowing protection law should be is abundant. It's comprehensive, it's consistent. Everyone online here can go and check it out. You go check Transparency International, the International Bar Association. So civil society is writing about it. International organization, the OECD, DC, the Council of Europe, Organization of American States, all these organizations have published guidance on how to adequately set up your law so that whistleblowers are protected and will come forward. But even the EU directive doesn't go all the way with these prescription and this guidance. And within the EU, a lot of countries did not fully implement the EU directive. They didn't even go all the way to be compliant with the EU directive. And some of them have been criticized, some of them have been fined, like as recently as 2 years ago, two months ago.
Yeah.
You had a fine for basically countries that dragged their feet. So we can speculate on why do countries don't find it are sort of feel threatened by whistleblowers, or they don't want to empower whistleblowers as much as civil society prescribes. But the fact is, they're not as protected and they're not as incentivized as they could be.
And is that a question of maturity? Is it something that we need to wait a little bit longer past the 2019 date of the directive, and to wait a little bit longer for the transposition to take hold, so that there's a broader understanding as to how best to protect those whistleblowers? The maturity of this regime, is that something that you have also looked at in your paper?
Not really with that angle. I don't know that we can speak of it as maturity. I don't know that it's the question of maturity. For sure, if you look at the different countries, different regions, the big difference is the scope of the law, national legislation. And the scope varies really depending on the legislation. I would say the first stage, if we want to talk about maturity, maybe the first stage for a country to have a law on whistleblowing is to address one specific concern, like anti-corruption. Like the only way really to fight corruption is to make sure that you have insiders that come and talk to you, basically, because corruption is a collusion,
Of course,
crime.
yeah.
So you need to, if you want to be impactful against corruption, you need to have whistleblowers come forward. So you have a series of laws that are described in this paper, for instance, that are protecting whistleblowers in the context of fighting crime or corruption in particular, fighting serious crime or corruption. But the more recent laws, the one that were enacted more recently, and particularly in the EU, are targeting basically any type of illegal activity, not restricted. So there are laws that are dedicated to whistleblowing, not dedicated to anti-corruption.
Understood.
Singaporean law, Jordan law, Ecuador law, they're dedicated to anti-corruption, and they have provisions on whistleblowing. On the EU laws, most recent, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are dedicated to whistleblowing and have a big scope. And some of them don't even require some illegal behavior. They can just address, whistleblowers can be protected for just pointing to risks to health, safety, the environment. And that's much better in terms of use of whistleblowers, because whistleblowers can help prevent issues before they become problematic.
I think it's so interesting to hear it presented like that, because from where I sit, I can understand why in some places like Singapore or Jordan or in Latin America, there would be a higher consideration for combating anti-corruption before perhaps addressing health issues, privacy issues, or even environmental issues, because these are things that are really affecting people in their day-to-day life, the way that the government interacts with individuals and the way that individuals interact with the public sphere as well. But we can understand also why the diversity in the approach is different in Europe, because there's such a myriad of regulation that affects every aspect of our lives living in Europe. Absolutely. That it makes sense to have a broader, a broader view over those challenges, because ultimately, day to day, the vast majority of people living in most European countries are not going to be affected by corruption in the same way. So it's really interesting. But if I could turn back to the ILO paper,
Yeah, sure.
just very quickly, you highlighted this diversity in approaches towards anonymous reporters and towards retaliators specifically. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, you have different approaches on some of these angles. So the paper basically sort of tries to look at at the same 67 laws and so under certain angles, which are called indicators. And confidentiality and anonymity are some of these indicators. So on confidentiality, almost all laws agree that the identity of a whistleblower is confidential and should be protected as confidential information. But not all laws, there's no consensus on how to approach anonymous reports and should anonymous whistleblowers be granted any kind of protection. Some laws completely ignore the possibility of anonymous reporting. Other laws just exclude the protection for anonymous reports. They say a whistleblower should provide their name and identity in order to be protected.
Okay.
And you mentioned also retaliation. That's the same sort of logic. Every law, or almost every law, at least a very, very large group of the laws, the 67 laws, they say the purpose of whistleblower protection is protection against retaliation. You should not be retaliated against for speaking up. But not all these laws. Some much smaller group of these laws enact sanctions for retaliators, which means that even though you as a whistleblower can be protected, which means that you should not be retaliated against, it still does not create a disincentive for other people to be the retaliator. And therefore, it exposes you more. So you have a big diversity of approaches in setting up remedies for whistleblowers, giving whistleblowers avenues for making them whole after having been retaliated, and then even less consensus on the retaliator, how to treat the retaliator. Should they be disciplined, basically?
If I could just follow up
Sure.
very briefly on that, do you think that in the compliance community generally, we benefit from having these diversities of approach so that we have a bit of trial and error understanding as to ways that things work well, ways that things that don't work well, understanding that from a cultural perspective, things may need to work slightly differently in different countries in order to be effective? Or do you think that we would benefit from a greater consensus across these 67 jurisdictions that you have reviewed?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would say that the culture the difference in cultures is not so much important between countries as within organizations.
Very interesting.
And I would say that if you can basically try to look at these different practices and see which fits more your organizational culture. You have basically you can see there are different approaches, different ways to manage whistleblower protection and retaliators. You can decide, okay, where should I set the bar in my organization? And I think it's more important to have a consistent approach across your organization, across countries, than trying to be very, very to differentiate your approach based on where you operate.
Excellent. Thank you, Max. I know that's maybe putting you a bit off guard, but a great answer to a challenging question. I'd love to turn it over to the audience now for our first of two polls. And the question before you is, which of the following is your biggest challenge with whistleblowing today? Understanding legal obligations across jurisdictions, building internal trust so people actually report, ensuring anonymity and data protection, training managers to handle reports properly, and integrating whistleblowing into existing compliance tools. And we're seeing the numbers that are coming up now, and it's always interesting to sort of see the live interaction from the audience. Any feedback that we get, including your responses to these polls, is incredibly helpful to us to understand what it is that people are interested in learning about, and also the challenges that people are dealing with generally. So we see here that it looks like building internal trust is taking the lead quite strongly, which is interesting. Is that something that you would have expected, Max, or is it a bit off?
No, absolutely not. And I mean, we can talk about it now, but this is something I wanted to talk about.
Well, maybe we'll wait till we get to
All
it.
right.
But it's good to see that actually in integrating whistleblowing into the existing compliance tools is something that is the least concerning to the group, which is, I think, nice to see, especially as provider of whistleblowing compliance tools. So maybe we'll jump right into the next section with this in mind, understanding that we're going to touch on building trust in the near future. Moving from policy to practice. In your view, what are the biggest disconnects between legal frameworks and what organizations are actually doing?
Well, the first thing I would like to talk about is not the disconnect, but the similarity.
Okay.
In the law, as I mentioned, the whistleblowers are not as protected as they could, and I think there is a lot of defiance from some of these legislators about how useful whistleblowers can be. And I feel like in organizations, when I help organizations, I see that not all organizations value whistleblowers as a potential source of information, as a potential assistance to solve their problems. And that's where the trust issue comes in, because trust is a two-way street. So if an organization does not project trust in their potential whistleblowers, then whistleblowers will not come forward.
Of course.
People are very good at reading, between the lines. So if you have just some standard language in your code of conduct and you're not projecting trust, people will know better than to, stick their neck out. And then the problem is that the only people who are going to use your whistleblowing platforms are the one with an agenda, and they want to use it or they want to abuse the system. And then you have sort of self-fulfilling prophecy because you say, hey, see, I told you we would only get these, bad faith calls in the hotline.
Right.
And this is a sort of a bad cycle. Whereas if you build trust, if you try to genuinely project trust, then it will be much more effective.
And would you say that this is something that matters maybe above any other approach that you could take in order to really build the efficacy of your whistleblowing platform?
I mean, for sure, the way whistleblowing is perceived is it perceived as a tool that is genuinely valued by management? This is the first step for its success. So you need to work on communicating and making sure people understand that this is not purely cosmetic.
And one of the challenges I think that we all deal with in trust, with trust in our professional lives, in our personal lives, is how can you functionally assess that there is trust, and specifically in this context, in a Speak Up channel?
It's very interesting because there is this, I think, this maxim by Peter Drucker saying, "What cannot be measured cannot be managed."
Exactly. Yeah.
But I've always been very skeptical of how we can measure, trust in the system, especially when it comes to whistleblowing, because for the past 15 years, you've had all these companies, multinational companies that have had a whistleblowing platform in place, even way before the directive. Companies have started communicating on how many reports they get. And because people love metrics so much, people are trying to analyze and slice and dice this data by industry, by geography.
Right.
But I don't know that it is the right approach because, I'm skeptical. In my experience, whistleblowing protection works and can be very effective, and the whistleblowing platform can be not very much used because whistleblowing. But if the whistleblowing system works, it deters actually people from misconduct. If you know that if you do something, you might get reported or get caught because your team is not going to cover up for you. They have avenues to report to bypass you. Then maybe you're not going to do things that you would otherwise do. And also, if you know that if something is wrong in your team, then there's a possibility that your boss knows about it because that the whistleblowing platform will bypass all management levels. The last person you want to hear about a problem in your team is your boss.
Of course.
And whistleblowing allows your boss's boss to know before you.
Right.
So, in fact, if the whistleblowing platform exists and it's well operated, then basically people will be incentivized to open their door and listen to their team's problems. So I don't know that the metrics are so useful in that context.
So how would you then measure a hotline? Are you saying that it's impossible to measure? Is it impossible to measure the efficacy or the good function of a platform?
No, I would just say that the fact that it's not, its use is not as prevalent might not be a good indicator, but you have other indicators.
Okay.
I would recommend, and that's something that is very well known in the compliance community, to integrate questions on whistleblowing, speaking up, integrity in the employee survey.
Okay.
So you have like this, generally this yearly company-wide employee survey, which is here to measure engagement and the how people feel, and you include in this questionnaires, in these surveys, specific questions about do I feel comfortable speaking up about an issue? Do I fear retaliation? Have I seen improper behavior over the past 12 months, and what did I do? Did I report it, or did I keep it for myself? And if you can measure these responses over time, that's how you can really, I think, measure the impact you're creating with your whistleblowing platform.
And this is so interesting because it goes back to a conversation that we recently had on one of our webinars about the importance of monitoring. And I think that if you can include this through your ongoing monitoring, and you can track a trend, then to Drucker's maxim, that which is trackable is something that can be managed.
Absolutely.
So this is a really good way to sort of draw that back together. But we'll take a quick break, and we'll jump into our second poll, which is, what are you focusing on? What are you focusing your whistleblowing efforts on this year? And your options are meeting legal requirements, upgrading our internal processes, increasing awareness and trust internally, replacing or optimizing your current tool, or we haven't decided yet. And we haven't decided yet is a completely reasonable answer. We understand how challenging it can be to actually get through all of the things that you're trying to do in your role as compliance officers. So I wouldn't be shocked if we had a couple people answering there. But again, it looks like we have a fairly clear leader out of the gate on increasing awareness and trust internally. So trust is the word of the day.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Interesting to see that, again, this is carrying our conversation. Well, we've talked a bit about trust now, but I'd love to get your insight, Max, into what does a good program look like? And how do we get it right? For organizations that are aiming to improve, to build the trust, for example, is one of the things that people are really focusing on. What is it that they need to do internally in order to see that improvement before them?
Well, I mean, the first step, of course, is to have a framework that is compliant, that works, from a technology standpoint, that is sound and it's reliable. But that's not enough to build trust. To build trust, I think you need to go beyond your strictly legal obligations. If you just stick to what's required and you don't go the extra mile, I think people will not be confident that you really mean what you're saying, and that you really want to hear what they have to say. I've never seen a company guilty of over communication.
Okay.
So I think really communicating on your framework, being transparent on how it works, and even explaining to employees, this is what it looks behind the curtain. This is who will receive your report. This is the group that will read the reports and assess whether they should be investigated or not, or this is the triage sort of approach. People are really interested in that, and so being transparent about how that works really helps. Being transparent about, okay, what happens if there is a report against me? What are my rights? What are my obligations? So explaining all this in a document that is accessible to everyone, in a Q&A, or even in as part of your main communication on Speak Up is really important, because people have all these questions. Sometimes they don't quite dare to ask. But if you're very proactive about it and say, hey, this is how we manage things here. So don't be afraid to over communicate, basically.
I think it's really interesting that you identified the need to also openly communicate with a person who is a subject of a report. Because I think that sometimes we do miss that in the way that we are analyzing the efficacy of our programs and platforms. Very important. But maybe turning it back to the whistleblower themselves in this context, how do you manage that communication on an ongoing basis?
Well, I think the first step is to allow, as much as possible, the whistleblower to communicate with you, and for that to remove as many hurdles as possible in the way the message is reported. I've seen many companies trying to prepare triage by asking mandatory questions in their form and asking the whistleblower to, first of all, like qualify from a legal standpoint, decide is explain,
So challenging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And here you're creating barriers for whistleblowers at every step. Like, you have to put yourself in the shoes of a whistleblower who doesn't know things and who think, oh, if I respond to this question wrong, then maybe I will be in trouble. So be as open as possible, create as little hurdles as possible. What's interesting in terms of measurement is to maybe measure how many reports get started and not completed.
Right.
I don't know if that can be tracked, but if that
Absolutely,
could be,
it can be.
that's nice.
Yeah.
I mean, I would want to know this. As a compliance officer, I would want to know at which point in the completion of the report, whistleblower said, I'm not sure I'm going to go through with this based on the questions. And so add as much non-mandatory free text fields as possible. And then once you receive the report from the whistleblower, then again, don't be afraid to over-communicate. I don't think that whistleblowers are turned down by communication. On the contrary, I think they're reassured by knowing that there is someone on the other end of the line that is listening to their speak up. So respond, acknowledge receipt, of course. That's the even mandatory step from a legal standpoint.
Yes.
But also ask follow-up questions. Anything that's missing in the report, you can ask, or if you have evidence, ask for information, and reassure the whistleblower on what are the next steps, what is going to happen. And when the report is closed, tell them. You don't have to tell them more than, we looked into it and we managed it, but at least let them know now it's over.
I think it's a really great way to characterize that it's not just about the volume of communication, but it's about the type of communication. And that in order to engage a whistleblower, you need to sort of meet them where they are, rather than just making certain assumptions about their ability to recount a certain issue, to understand the legal implications of a certain issue. So I think, really taking it down to a very base framework as to how to entice somebody to give you a fuller picture of a story over time is really valuable insight.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. Now we've talked about how to talk to people. How do we match our walk to the talk?
I mean, of course, the first step is everything we said takes resources, right? And compliance teams, I've never seen someone guilty of over communicating. I've never seen a compliance officer telling me, I have enough resources. I'm good. I have as many resources as I need, except in very, very few cases, like right after an enforcement situation. But mostly you need to manage with few resources, and you need to accomplish a lot. So for me, the way to do it is to sort of spread the effort across functions, and don't be afraid to work hand in hand with other functions. I think HR is a key stakeholder, a key partner for compliance, because there will be a lot of reports anyway
Certainly.
about HR issue. So don't be afraid to associate HR to either the triage process or telling them, we will give you access to some of the reports, or we will send reports your way, either for your information, because there's nothing that can be done, but at least it's important that you know what's going on in this entity or in this team, or for your action. Here is not something that we can investigate. Investigation may not necessarily be the response to every issue, but at least you should know and maybe talk to the manager or do some coaching or do some training. Same thing with audit. Just for your information, this is the kind of cases we had. Maybe in your next audit, you can take it as in your risk modeling approach. You can use this. So spread the efforts. The efforts. This will also help disseminate the culture of speaking up. You'll have more ambassadors, more people that can explain what happens when you speak up, and more people that can say, it's not a black box. It does not get lost. It works, and people really care when they have reports. So this is one way to walk the talk. The other way is very simply not to retaliate.
Right.
Against whistleblowers. This is harder than it.
Is it though? Is it harder than you would expect?
Yes, because the person who retaliates is not the compliance officer.
No.
So
that's true.
So it's easy for a compliance officer not to retaliate.
Right.
But it's not necessarily easy for everyone involved in a given report to understand the importance of not retaliating. And once someone has been retaliated against, once someone has retaliated, it's too late, because you have to discipline the people who retaliated. The person who has been retaliated against has lost all faith in the process. So it's too late. So maybe the way to approach it is not only you communicate, you have a non-retaliation policy. Nobody should be retaliated against for speaking up. But then whenever you get a report and you start investigating, or you start simply inquiring, discussing with the manager, you said, we're discussing with you because we receive a speak up report. It's very important that you don't try to guess who reported.
Right.
It's very important that you don't change your behavior towards your team based on who you think reported. I've seen people retaliate against other people who had not reported anything, just because they thought they were the reporters. So don't try to guess. Don't try to change your attitude in exchange for you cooperating. We can promise you a fair and prompt investigation of the matter, so that you can go back to your duties and life can go on. But in the meantime, don't change anything.
Easier said than done, I think, for many
course,
people.
of course.
Right? I think the human nature is always to try and determine, okay, well, who is trying to do something that I perceive as an attack on me, even though that person who is making a whistleblowing report may believe that there was an attack on another person, on another entity, on the environment, etc. Just going back a step to where you had identified the benefit of building sort of an ambassadorship across the organization. I love that image, because I think that the more people that are reinforcing the value, the better that it's going to be. And I think that also, in turn, it becomes easier for people to understand, if they are the subject of a report, what the value of that report is, and what the value of allowing the investigation to occur is, and ultimately that they, as the subject of the report, will be treated in a fair fashion. So, we've talked about the ambassadorship, we've talked about the building of trust, we've talked about communicating over communicating, we've talked about how to walk that walk. How are we in our organizations best suited to track those signals, to understand, is everything that we've done working?
Well, the one ambassador that we can add to your list is actually, first of all, whistleblowers. If they blew the whistle and nothing happened to them afterwards, then they're the best ambassadors.
Absolutely.
And I would go so far as to add people who were the subject of a whistleblower report or investigation, if they've been treated fairly, if they felt like, okay, you had to look into it, but then, you gave them a chance to explain, and at the end there was nothing, they did not get in trouble, they will potentially use the whistleblower hotline later. They will come to you directly, maybe as a compliance officer or as an investigator, say, hey, I have a problem. Because they will feel like this will be handled properly. So just a side comment on who will be your ambassador. But then on how to monitor whether people are really walking the talk of not retaliating. Well, again, very, very obvious, but you need to follow up with whistleblowers after the investigation is closed to make sure they're not being retaliated against. You need to ask them a few weeks, a few months, maybe a year, to see if their career was influenced by them being a whistleblower, negatively, of course. If they're leaving the company, I think it's really important, more important than any other employee, to have an exit interview with them, to understand, are they leaving the company because they could not stay anymore? Being a whistleblower, they could not. And how does being a whistleblower affected their employability outside the organization? Have they been marked or not? So that's really also important to see. Definitely. What the culture of the organization, the industry, where you are. So you can ask whistleblowers to come forward, like come to me if you're being retaliated, but they will value the fact even more than you check in with them on a regular basis. And also, of course, proactively, it's all about diffusing the culture. So again, there will be better ambassadors. Can you imagine, like, you come back from 15 minutes meeting with your compliance officer, asking you, have you been retaliated against? How you come back to your open space and you say, hey, well, they look like they really care about not retaliation. So, they're helping with this ambassadorship.
Excellent. Well, I think that for me, the thing that is abundantly clear, not just through this conversation, but just in trying to build a compliance program that works, is that the compliance framework will only ever give us structure. It's really up to us to make the most out of that structure, to build the trust, to build the ambassadorships, to ensure that whistleblowers are getting protection, to ensure there's no retaliation. It is an ongoing challenge. It's one that's worth fighting, absolutely. I think any organization, it behooves them to take this very seriously and to find a way that will work within that organizational culture.
I completely agree with what you said. Also, building trust is a long process. It takes a lot of time to create that trust capital that will make your speak up process efficient. Even if, again, very efficient, even if the speak up line is not used, the speak up can be efficient in influencing the integrity of the organization, but also trust can be destroyed pretty fast.
Very quickly. And for me, integrity is such an important element in building any kind of long-term sustainable organization, not only internally but externally. Because if it's, unfortunately, things that are rotten at the core often collapse on themselves. So thank you so much, Max. Welcome. This was a really great conversation. Do you have a few minutes for our audience?
Absolutely.
Maybe we'll take a couple of questions. If we could maybe get them slightly bigger on screen, that would be great. Okay, so we have a question. We have a question here regarding the survey. Is there a trend in the motivation to blow the whistle? Increasingly, money is a motive for organizations rather than the general good and other moral compass motives.
Okay, so the paper itself does not look at whistleblowing laws or on. With one of the there's no indicator on bounties or reward, financial reward for blowing the whistle, but it looks at what is the threshold for protection in terms of what does it take to be awarded whistleblowing protection, and there's a lot of discussions in different in all the local laws about the good faith threshold. So you should blow the whistle in good faith. What does it mean to be a good faith with whistleblowers? And here you're talking about moral compass or the motive of the whistleblower. Basically, Transparency International says whistleblower protection should exist irrespective of what the motive is.
Right.
Because if you start looking at the motive, then you can basically deny protection to anyone. If you're saying, I read your mind and I can see that you have an ulterior motive in speaking up, therefore I deny you the protection of a whistleblower. Then it doesn't work. Then it creates skepticism because it creates the potential for arbitrary decision. So the protection should be granted irrespective of the motive. But that's not the case in a lot of legislations. Even like countries like Germany, they say the whistleblower should not have a personal interest in whistleblowing. What does it mean? If I'm blowing the whistle on my boss, do I have an interest in my boss getting disciplined so that I can be promoted? Could you argue that it's in my best career interest, or maybe it's in my interest to get rid of a harassing boss?
Yeah.
So it's really hard to set conditions like this. So even if the law does it, I think in your organization you shouldn't.
I think that one of the really important things to remember is that the investigation is there to flush out some of those motives to determine whether or not there is a frivolous report that is being made. So I think that we can have somebody that is perhaps having an ulterior motive, but the validity of that motive should come to light in the course of the investigation. And irrespective of what the motive is, if there is validity to the claim itself,
exactly,
that should still be brought to its full and final conclusion. And then, depending on what the motive is and the reporter and what else is happening, maybe there are further investigations that are required. But that is sort of the puzzle that needs to be put together through that process. We've got a really great question here, and it was something that I was tempted to ask during our conversation, and that was, to what extent do you think that internal whistleblowing management is actually conflicted from the process?
What do you mean conflicted?
Well, I think that in the way that I was envisioning it as we were chatting is, when there are reports, and especially in the context of when you have created these ambassadorships through HR, audit, legal, etc., the more nodes that you introduce into that ecosystem, the more challenge there is from a conflict perspective, because somebody who may be directly involved or potentially indirectly involved in the report now has more visibility to what the report is, and could then also give rise to a challenge in a fair adjudication of an investigation.
Well, then, I mean, the first criterion to be able to assess and investigate a report is to be independent from the facts reported. I think that if you want to have a credible process, you need to ensure that whoever will be involved in the triage assessment and, of course, in the investigation of any issue does not have a vested interest in the outcome of this process. So you need to ensure that the system allows, if there's a report against you, that preferably you're not going to see it. And of course, we can document that you at no point were involved in deciding what should we do with that report. This decision should be taken by people who are independent from you. So you need to have in your reporting system, like either automated or somewhat manual, but at least you need to have anticipated, okay, what if there is a report against the head of HR? What if there is a report against the compliance officer? Who will be in charge of managing it?
But these are internal protocols that you build as part of your process.
Very interesting. I mean, you need to anticipate. That is something that sometimes organizations don't want to discuss. Like,
Sure.
What if there's an allegation against the CEO? Because
Right.
you want the CEO to sign off on the policy, and you need to get him to sign off, or her, on the policy, with the possibility that he or she might be accused of misconduct. They need to understand it's very standard. It's in their interest to have such a process in place, because if you have to improvise
On the spot.
it's not going to be good.
No,
And-
I agree. I agree. I think that anytime you're going to be put in a position where you need to come up with a process and there's something particularly sensitive that is relying on the outcome of that process, you've already lost in that situation. Do we have time for one more? Okay, great. This is an interesting question on nomenclature, and I've had this conversation before, and it is the term whistleblower has so many negative connotations, and a lot of that likely comes from the period in which the term whistleblower was being used prior to the proliferation of recent laws. So how would you view potentially a rebranding around this concept, if at all something? Or do you think, you know what it is, and to paraphrase Shakespeare, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet?
It's interesting. In some of my clients internally, they call them reporters.
Okay.
It's very factual. It's the
True.
person who reported something.
Yeah.
But internally, we can call them whistleblowers, because it just depends. I think there is some negative connotation in some contexts. In some other connotations, in some other context, it's actually better to be a whistleblower than just a reporter. If you're the one raising the attention of the organization to something really bad that you can see and other people cannot see, it's actually good. I don't know. I think it probably, for many reports that I've seen, calling people whistleblowers when just basically bringing something to your attention, reporting something, is probably too I would say serious of a term.
I guess I question the need to be too precious with the language. And I think that, for better or for worse, sometimes we have language that has been developed in a way that very much conveys a clear image of what it is that we are hopeful people will be doing. And I think that the idea of a reporter is absolutely true, is factual, but it doesn't necessarily convey the seriousness of what it is that we are attempting to combat with this type of program. So it's an interesting one, and I think that anytime you have a question over semantics or the complexity of language, everybody will have an interesting opinion, and I think that any number of words could potentially work. But from a culture perspective, depending on your organization, it could be valuable for you to frame that issue in a different way.
At least when you say whistleblower, people understand what you're talking about.
Right.
And at least they understand the need for protection. So for better or worse, I think, so far I've not seen a term that projects this kind of, has this kind of significance for everyone, that everyone agrees and understand what it means. So I think for better or worse, I like whistleblower.
Excellent. Max, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us today.
Thank you.
It was a really insightful conversation, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to speak again in the future, perhaps on the back of another one of your very interesting papers, but otherwise just to discuss the issues in the space.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone for your questions.
Thank you for your participation again today during our polls. We had so many questions, and unfortunately, from a time perspective, we could only address 3. But if there are people that are still interested in having some answers or continuing the conversation, please provide them to us. We would love to go through them and to respond to you. If you have any other interest in what it is that we are doing here at Speak Up, please visit www.speakup.com, where you'll be able to find access to all of our content and our media, back webinars, podcasts, as well as our think pieces in the space. My name is Robert Greco, Legal Director here at Speak Up. Thank you again for joining, and we will see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.